Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we turn our attention to the deathbed of one of history's most powerful monarchs, a man whose empire was so vast it was said the sun never set upon it. But for King Philip II of Spain, the sun was indeed setting, and it was doing so in the most gruesome, unspeakable way imaginable. We'll be tiptoeing through the hushed, incense-choked halls of the San Lorenzo de El Escorial, the royal monastery he built, and witnessing his final, agonizing descent into a living hell. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed. His death was so utterly horrifying, it's the kind of thing that sticks with you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the summer of 1598, and the air in the Spanish court is thick with a different kind of summer heat. A humid, suffocating dread. Philip II, the most powerful man in Europe, is not well. You see him, a man of 61, his usual grave and solemn demeanour now etched with lines of pain. His famously pale face, once a mask of unwavering control, is now sallow, and his eyes, usually piercing and intelligent, seem clouded with a subtle, yet persistent exhaustion. This isn't just the weariness of old age. There's something else at play, something sinister and unsettling. The first signs are almost innocuous, a simple ache in his right arm, followed by a general feeling of malaise. It's the kind of thing you might brush off after a long day of, well, conquering the world. A pulled muscle, perhaps, from writing all those decrees with that famously tiny handwriting of his. But you know better. You feel the tremor in his hand as he reaches for a document, a small, almost imperceptible shake that wasn't there before. This is the beginning of the end. The court physicians, a cadre of learned men in heavy velvet robes, huddle in hushed tones. They talk of gout, dropsy, and other fashionable ailments of the time. They apply salves and poultices, mixing herbs and strange concoctions in their endless quest to soothe their sovereign. They try to convince themselves, and each other, that this is merely a passing indisposition. But you, with the benefit of hindsight, can already see the cracks in the facade. The ache in his arm doesn't go away. Instead, it spreads, a slow-burning fire that seems to consume the very marrow of his bones. His legs begin to swell, and he finds it increasingly difficult to walk, to even stand. You watch him struggle to make his way to Mass, his piety a fierce and unyielding thing, a testament to his own belief that he was God's chosen instrument on earth. But even that strength is now failing him, bending under the weight of an unseen enemy. One of the quirks of Philip's reign, a detail you might find a bit odd, is his obsession with relics. He had a truly vast collection, over 7,000 of them in fact, housed within his magnificent palace of El Escorial. It's a slightly macabre detail, isn't it? As if he was building a kind of holy museum to prepare for his own mortality. He had fingers of saints, skulls of martyrs, even what was claimed to be a thorn from Christ's crown. You can almost hear the quiet, rattling sound as his own bones begin to protest, as if the holy relics themselves are becoming restless, sensing the impending tragedy. This deep religious fervour, this belief in the tangible, physical power of faith will become a central theme in his final days. He is not just a king, but a devoted son of the Church, and he believes his suffering must have a divine purpose. Historians still argue whether Philip's early symptoms were a misdiagnosis or simply the first whispers of a more complex malady. Some believe it was a form of arthritis, others suggest a kidney disease exacerbated by his notoriously rich diet. But as you watch the illness progress, you start to feel a cold certainty creep in. This is not a simple, treatable ailment. This is something that is eating him alive from the inside out. His doctors, in their pompous ignorance, are throwing every remedy they know at the problem, but nothing works. They prescribe purges and bloodletting, the classic go-to treatments of the era. The theory, of course, is that his body is filled with bad humours that need to be released. You can practically see the exhaustion and fear in his eyes as they bring out the leeches, a slimy, squirming testament to the limits of 16th century medicine. He submits to it all with a stoic resignation that is almost more terrifying than the illness itself. The king's court, a beehive of courtiers and hangers-on, is suddenly a place of whispers and sideways glances. The air of power and authority that usually emanates from the monarch is starting to falter. The simple fact that the king is ill is a political earthquake. An empire built on one man's will and immense bureaucratic skill is now facing the prospect of that will being compromised. The courtiers, like vultures, are circling, trying to gauge the severity of the situation. You see them, with their elaborate ruffs and tight-fitting doublets, their faces a mask of feigned concern. But their eyes are already calculating, already looking to the future without Philip. The sense of stability is eroding day by day, replaced by a growing anxiety. You find yourself in the palace corridors, overhearing a conversation between two younger nobles. One is scoffing at the doctor's diagnoses, whispering that the king is simply old and worn out, a funny thought given his age by modern standards. The other, however, is much more sombre. He mentions a troubling detail, a terrible, ulcerous wound that has appeared on the king's leg, an angry, weeping sore that no one can seem to heal. This is the first concrete sign that something is terribly, horribly wrong. A simple ache is one thing, but a festering wound? That's an entirely different matter. It's a physical manifestation of the rot that is taking hold, and it's not just one wound. Small red patches appear on his skin, like angry little islands in a sea of pale flesh. The stench, a faint metallic odour that you can only just detect, begins to cling to his person, a telltale sign that his body is turning against him. It's a slow, methodical betrayal, and you are a helpless, horrified observer. The king's suffering is only just beginning, and you can already feel the chilling horror of what's to come. This is the moment when the curtain is pulled back and the true nightmare begins. The initial aches and quiet malaise you witnessed have now given way to something far more sinister. The royal court, once a bastion of order and rigid ceremony, is now buzzing with a low hum of anxiety. You're walking through the polished stone corridors of the royal palace, and the air itself feels heavy, as if the very walls are holding their breath. The king, your king, is no longer making a pretense of his illness being a mere bout of gout. It has escalated, and the whispers you overheard have now become a chorus of barely concealed concern. The ulcerous wound on his leg is not healing. In fact, it is spreading, an angry, weeping stain on his royal person. It has been joined by other sores, small at first, but growing in size and virulence. They are starting to appear on his chest, his arms, his back. It is a slow-motion catastrophe playing out in the most opulent of settings. You catch a glimpse of him as he is being moved from his bed to a chair, a difficult and painful process that requires the assistance of several attendants. He groans, a low guttural sound that he tries to stifle, but you hear it all the same. The man who once commanded fleets and armies now seems unable to command his own body. He's hunched over, his shoulders stooped, his head bowed. His skin, once a picture of noble paleness, now has a mottled, sallow quality. A faint, almost sickly sweet odour of decay now clings to him. A subtle, but unmistakable harbinger of what's to come. It's the kind of scent that you can't quite place at first, but once you do, it never leaves you. It's the smell of things turning, of life beginning its slow and tragic descent into stillness. The court physicians are in a state of barely contained panic. Their initial diagnoses of gout and dropsy now sound hollow and naive. They're trying everything, from strange herbal poultices to the application of leeches, but nothing seems to stem the tide. They whisper about a putrefaction of the humours, a fancy way of saying his body is simply rotting from the inside out. One of the more colourful and frankly disgusting remedies they suggest involves a concoction of crocodile dung and various spices. Yes, you heard that right. Crocodile dung. Apparently, it was believed to have certain healing properties, a kind of pungent panacea for all that ails you. You can almost imagine the poor attendant tasked with sourcing that particular ingredient. A grim, thankless job. The fact that the most powerful man in the world is being subjected to such bizarre and frankly repulsive treatments speaks volumes about the desperation of the moment. It's not just a physical decay, but a kind of moral and intellectual one as well. This period of time, the late 16th century, was a time of intense superstition and a blending of science and magic. Historians still argue whether the medical community of the time truly believed in these outlandish remedies, or if they were simply grasping at straws, trying to reassure themselves and the court that they were doing something. The sheer absurdity of some of their treatments can be seen as a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of control in a situation that was spiralling completely out of it. The king's doctors, for all their pompous learning, were utterly clueless about what was actually happening. They were more concerned with pleasing the monarch and maintaining their own status than with any real kind of healing. You're standing near the entrance to the king's private chambers, a place that was once a hub of activity and governance, but is now a place of hushed tones and anxious glances. The oral landscape has changed completely. The clatter of armour, the bustle of courtiers, the sharp, authoritative voice of the king giving commands, all of that is gone. It has been replaced by the soft shuffling of feet, the low murmur of prayers, and the occasional, almost imperceptible groan from within the chamber itself. The king is slowly being walled off from his own empire, a prisoner in his own palace. He's no longer receiving visitors in the grand throne room, but from his bed, a place that now seems less a symbol of comfort and more a makeshift tomb. One of the quirky facts about Philip's character, which becomes even more poignant now, is his immense work ethic. He was known for his relentless attention to detail, poring over every document, every letter, every decree that came across his desk. He would work for hours on end, his quill scratching across the parchment, a man driven by a profound sense of duty. He believed that he was personally responsible for every aspect of his vast empire, but now, even that is becoming impossible. His trembling hand can no longer hold the quill steady for long periods. His concentration, once legendary, is now failing him, broken by waves of pain. He tries to continue his work, dictating letters to his secretary, but you can see the effort it takes, the sheer will he has to exert just to get through a single sentence. It's like watching a majestic ship being slowly taken apart by a storm, plank by plank. The court is now divided. Some believe this is a divine test, that God is chastising the king for some unknown sin. Others, more pragmatic, see it as a political opportunity. The succession is not entirely settled, and the various factions centred around the different branches of the royal family are beginning to make their moves. You see them, in the corners of the great halls, engaged in intense whispered conversations, their eyes darting nervously towards the king's chambers. The illness of the king is not just a personal tragedy, it is a profound threat to the stability of the entire Spanish Empire. And the stench, that subtle, sickening odour, is a constant reminder of the fragility of power and the inevitability of decay. The court is rotting just as its king is. This is not the end, not yet, but you can already feel the cold, clammy hand of death reaching out. It's a hand that is about to close on the king and, in a way, on the golden age of Spain. The dread is palpable, and you, a silent witness, are feeling it all. The subtle, sickly sweet odour that you first detected has now grown into an undeniable, suffocating presence. You're standing in the antechamber of King Philip II's private quarters, and the air is no longer merely heavy with dread, but with the undeniable stench of decay. It's a multi-layered assault on the senses, a metallic coppery smell of old blood, the cloying sweet scent of rotting flesh, and the acrid tang of various medicinal poultices and incense meant to mask the reality of the situation. It's a losing battle, and everyone knows it. The king is no longer just ill. He is a man whose body is actively and horribly failing him, rotting from the inside out. He is bedridden now, a permanent fixture in the great bed of state. It is a magnificent piece of furniture, with carved wood and rich velvet hangings, but you see it for what it truly is, a coffin, already prepared. You're allowed a brief glimpse of him through a half-open door, and the sight is shocking. His face is swollen and discoloured, the skin a mottled mix of yellow and angry red. The ulcers you first heard about have multiplied and deepened, a galaxy of weeping sores that cover his legs and back. They are not just on the surface, they are deep festering wounds that seem to go down to the bone. You can see the fear in the eyes of the attendants who tend to him, a mixture of pity and revulsion, as they change his bandages and try to keep him clean. It's a job that requires not just strength, but an iron will, and a nose that has long since given up on its duty. The medical treatments of the time, once an object of morbid curiosity, now seem utterly grotesque. Remember that crocodile dung concoction? Well, they've moved on to even more bizarre remedies. One of the more stomach-churning treatments involved the application of live pigeons to his feet. The belief was that the birds, through some mystical process, would draw out the pestilential humours from his body. You can almost picture the scene. A man, once the most powerful in the world, lying in his bed, his legs swaddled in bandages and live birds flapping feebly against his feet. It would be a darkly comedic image if it weren't so tragic. His body in turn is responding in the most horrific way possible. The sores are now infested with vermin, a detail so repulsive that even the stoic court chroniclers of the time struggle to describe it. He is being devoured, slowly and methodically, by his own disease and the creatures it has attracted. This is a mainstream historical fact, though one often glossed over in the more sanitised versions of history. Philip II's death was a truly awful, prolonged ordeal. He spent 53 days bedridden, enduring unimaginable suffering. The details are not for the faint of heart, and you can only imagine the toll it took on his mind and spirit. His faith, which was so central to his identity, becomes both a source of strength and a source of immense anguish. He sees his suffering not just as an illness, but as a test, a trial sent from God to cleanse him of his sins and to prepare his soul for the next life. This is a man who ordered the executions of thousands in the name of the Inquisition, a man who saw himself as the righteous arm of God on earth. Now he believes he's paying the price for his imperfections, for his moral failings. A fringe tidbit that adds another layer of grim detail is the account of one of his physicians, a man named Hernando de la Guerra. In a letter, he described the king's condition in almost poetic terms of decay. He mentioned how the king's back, a particular site of torment, was so badly afflicted that it was impossible to touch without causing him immense pain. De la Guerra's account is a rare glimpse into the true horror of the situation, an unfiltered look at a death that was as undignified as his life was grand. He wrote of the king being eaten by his own flesh, a chilling phrase that sums up the entire ordeal. It's the kind of thing you read and you have to pause, to take a deep breath, and wonder how a human being could possibly endure such a thing. And yet, Philip did. Historians still argue whether Philip's stoic endurance was a genuine display of piety, or a kingly performance for his court and posterity. Some believe he was a true martyr, embracing his pain as a path to salvation. Others see it as a final, desperate act of control, a way of shaping his legacy even in the face of complete physical collapse. He continued to conduct business from his bed, receiving ambassadors and dictating letters. He was a man who, even as his body was betraying him, refused to let go of the reins of power. It's a testament to his immense will, but also to his profound loneliness. He was in a sense living and dying in a world of his own creation, a world where the king's will was absolute, even over the will of his own failing flesh. The contrast between the outward splendour of El Escorial and the inner rot of its master is almost unbearable. You're surrounded by magnificent frescoes, priceless tapestries, and the hushed sanctity of the monastery. And yet, all of it is overshadowed by the single unassailable fact of the king's slow, agonising death. The soundscape of the palace has changed once again. The low hum of anxiety is gone, replaced by a profound silence. It is the silence of waiting, the silence of a royal court holding its collective breath, a silent acknowledgement that the inevitable is approaching. The king, once the centre of a universe, is now a man alone in his bed, surrounded by the physical manifestations of his own mortality. He is a living, breathing warning, a testament to the fact that power and piety are no defence against the final and most gruesome betrayal of all. He is a king no longer, but a man being devoured alive by his own body. And you, a silent observer, can only watch the horrifying tableau unfold. The air in the San Lorenzo de El Escorial is not just heavy with the scent of decay, it's now a cacophony of desperation. You've been a silent witness to the king's descent, and the horror of his condition has only intensified. The court physicians, a group of men who once exuded an air of supreme confidence, are now little more than panicked figures, their faces a mix of professional concern and personal terror. The crocodile dung and pigeon remedies have, unsurprisingly, failed. The ulcers on Philip's body are now a horrifying constellation of weeping, festering wounds, a landscape of putrefaction that defies belief. The king is in constant, agonising pain, and his cries, though muffled by the thick tapestries and heavy oak doors of his chamber, are a constant, low-frequency torment for the entire palace. In their frantic search for a cure, the physicians are resorting to increasingly outlandish and desperate measures. They are a mainstream historical fact, though one we often forget that medical practice in the late 16th century was still steeped in ancient beliefs about humours and miasmas. This is not a time of clinical trials and controlled studies. It's a time of frantic, almost magical thinking. They bring in a variety of new remedies, a grim parade of concoctions that sound more like witches' brews than medical treatments. One of the more peculiar ideas, a truly fringe tidbit, is the belief that the king's suffering could be alleviated by a change in his environment, a kind of geographic cure. They suggest moving his bed to different parts of the monastery, believing that certain stones or air currents might hold a curative power. You can see the weary resignation on the king's face as they propose this. He knows, that moving him would be an act of profound torture, each shift of his body causing an unimaginable spike of pain. And yet, he allows them to try, a desperate hope flickering in his pain-clouded eyes. The doctors, led by the renowned physician and surgeon Cristobal de Vega, are not just failing the king, they are actively making things worse. They prescribe a series of harsh purges, believing that they must rid the king's body of the corrupted humours, causing the rot. You can almost feel the collective groan of the attendants as they are tasked with administering these violent emetics and laxatives. The king, already weakened to the point of near collapse, is subjected to this brutal assault on his system. It's a tragic irony. They are trying to save him, but in their ignorance they are only hastening his end. The purges leave him dehydrated and in a state of exhaustion, and they do nothing to slow the relentless march of the disease. Historians still argue whether the physicians were genuinely trying to heal the king, or if they were simply trying to appear busy and competent to a terrified court. There is a strong case to be made for the latter. The royal court was a political minefield, and a doctor who admitted defeat could very well find his career, and even his life, in jeopardy. It was far safer to keep trying, no matter how bizarre or ineffective the treatments, than to admit that the king's fate was sealed. The physicians are not healers in the modern sense. They are courtiers with a specific skill set, and their first duty is to their own survival and reputation. They are not treating a man, but a symbol, and the symbol must be seen to be fought for until the very end. One of the more macabre details you learn during this time is the doctor's fascination with the physical waste products of the king. They meticulously collect and examine his urine and feces, believing that the colour, consistency and smell could provide clues to the true nature of his illness. You can imagine the grim little scene in a back room of the monastery. The doctors huddled over a chamber pot, their faces a mask of intense concentration. It's a slightly ridiculous image, a group of learned men trying to find divine truth in the king's bodily functions, but it's also deeply sad. It's a testament to the fact that their scientific knowledge had reached a dead end, and they were left with nothing but superstition and guesswork. The king, in the midst of all this physical torment, is also wrestling with a spiritual one. His religious fervour, which we've discussed before, is now his only real source of comfort. He has relics brought to his bedchamber, and he spends hours praying, his lips moving silently in a constant plea for divine intervention. He has a piece of wood, believed to be from the true cross, placed next to him, and he clutches it with a desperate grip. He's convinced that God is testing him, refining his soul through fire, and that his suffering is a kind of penance. You can see the conflict in his eyes. The physical pain is a constant nagging reality, but his faith gives it meaning. It's a way for him to find purpose in the complete and utter humiliation of his body. He's not just a patient, he is a penitent, and his deathbed has become a kind of holy crucible. The desperate efforts of the physicians, the bizarre remedies, and the king's unwavering piety all create a tableau of profound irony. The most powerful man in Europe, the man who controlled vast resources and commanded the loyalty of millions, is completely powerless against a simple, biological enemy. His immense wealth can't buy him a cure. His political acumen can't negotiate with his disease. All of his earthly power, everything he has built and fought for, is now utterly meaningless. The king's body is a democracy of decay, and the physicians, for all their fancy titles and learned treatises, are nothing more than helpless bystanders. It's a stark, brutal reality, and you are feeling it with every passing moment. The hope is gone, replaced by a grim, slow march towards the inevitable conclusion, and you, a silent observer, can do nothing but watch. The king's last hope is a delusion, and the end is drawing ever closer. The frantic attempts of the royal physicians have faded into the background, Their bizarre remedies now a forgotten footnote in a much larger and more profound drama. The air around the king's bedchamber, once filled with the scent of strange poultices and the low murmur of medical debate, is now dominated by the heavy, sweet scent of incense. You're standing in the hallowed halls of El Escorial, and the atmosphere has shifted completely. The focus is no longer on the body, but on the soul. King Philip II, having endured the futile ministrations of his doctors, has now turned his full attention to God, believing his suffering to be a divinely ordained trial. You see him, his face a mask of gaunt piety, his eyes closed in prayer. The pain, is a constant screaming reality, but he seems to be transcending it through sheer force of will. He has requested that a specific crucifix, one that he had commissioned for the monastery, be brought to his bedside. It is a stunning, life-size sculpture of Christ, its detail so realistic it's almost unsettling. He spends hours gazing at it, his lips moving silently, a whispered conversation between a dying king and his saviour. This is not a man who is simply a religious figurehead. This is a man for whom faith is a living, breathing, and now a pain-filled reality. He has a mainstream historical fact in his collection of relics, a piece of wood believed to be from the true cross, and he now has it placed on his chest, a heavy symbolic weight that he believes will ease his passage to the next world. The king's deepening piety is a complex and fascinating thing to watch. He is not just seeking comfort, he is seeking absolution. Remember his role in the Inquisition and the sheer scale of the blood that was shed in his name. He believed it was a righteous duty, a necessary act to maintain the purity of the faith. But now, in the face of his own mortality, you can almost feel the weight of those decisions pressing down on him. His suffering in his mind is not just a disease but a kind of cosmic balance, a way of atoning for the sins he committed, both personal and political. He is trying to make peace with his own conscience, to ensure that his place in heaven is secured. This is his final crusade, and the battlefield is his own rotting body. A quirky, almost touching tidbit from this time comes from the account of one of his attendants. The man noted that the king, in his feverish state, would often ask to be read to, not from official decrees or historical accounts, but from the lives of the saints. He was particularly fond of the stories of martyrs who endured unimaginable torture for their faith. You can almost hear the soft, hushed voice of the reader, the words of suffering and salvation filling the air, a strangely comforting presence amidst the decay. It's a moment of profound humanity, a powerful king finding solace in the stories of the powerless, a kind of shared understanding of pain. It's a detail that reminds you that for all his power and grandeur, Philip was, at the end, just a man terrified and seeking comfort. Historians still argue whether Philip's intense piety in his final months was a genuine spiritual awakening or a shrewd, calculated move to cement his legacy. Some scholars suggest that he was, to the very end, a masterful politician, and that his public displays of faith were designed to be a powerful message to his court and to the world. A message that said, "I am not a mere mortal being devoured by disease, but a holy martyr, chosen by God to suffer for the good of his people." Others, more romantically, believe that it was a genuine and deeply personal journey, a final reckoning with his own soul. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. He was a man for whom politics and piety were inextricably linked, and his death was no different. You are a fly on the wall as he receives the last rites. The Archbishop of Toledo, with a retinue of priests, enters the room. The sound of their prayers, the chinking of the thurible as it fills the air with incense, and the sonorous Latin of the liturgy all create a sense of profound, solemn finality. Philip is propped up in his bed, his body a twisted mess of agony, but his face is serene, a calm that seems to come from a place far beyond the physical world. He receives the last sacrament with a quiet dignity, and you can see a look of peace settle on his face, as if a great weight has been lifted from his shoulders. This is the moment where he seems to fully embrace his fate, to accept his torment as a necessary step on his journey to the next life. The political intrigue of the court, while not gone entirely, has been muted by the solemnity of the occasion. The courtiers, who were once circling like vultures, are now forced to show a display of public piety, their hands clasped in prayer, their heads bowed in respect. But you can see the furtive glances, the subtle shifts of power, the silent, unspoken knowledge that a new era is dawning. Philip, for all his pain and his newfound spiritual focus, is still the king, and his death will be the signal for a new power struggle. He is a man being devoured alive, and in a way, he is devouring the last of the old political order with him. His final act is a religious one, but you know that in the court of Philip II, even faith has a political dimension. He is a king, a man, and a dying soul all at once, and his final days are a testament to the fact that for him, those three things were never separate. The shift from the medical to the spiritual you witnessed in the last section has now solidified into a new and permanent reality. The setting for this final act is not a mere palace, but San Lorenzo de El Escorial, a place that is as much a monastery as it is a royal residence. And as Philip's condition worsens, the entire immense structure seems to shrink, to contract around the dying king, becoming his gilded cage, his tomb. You are walking through the hallowed halls of this architectural marvel, a place Philip himself had built and designed to be both a palace for his rule and a sepulchre for his family. It is a monument to his power and his piety, and it is now the stage for his final, agonizing performance. The Escorial, a mainstream historical fact, is a vast grey granite complex nestled at the foot of the Sierra de Guadarrama mountains, a place of stark beauty and immense symbolism. It's a place of quiet devotion, of endless corridors and countless paintings by masters like Titian and El Greco. But now it feels less like a palace and more like a mausoleum. The king's personal apartment, where he is now permanently bedridden, is strategically placed so that from his bed he can see the high altar of the basilica through an open door. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate design choice by Philip, a man who believed that even in death he should be in the presence of God. He built his own deathbed with the view of salvation in mind, a rather morbid but powerful detail. And now, this very design choice has become his singular, unrelenting focus. You're a silent witness to the daily routine of the dying king. The once bustling court has now been reduced to a small, devoted retinue of his children, a few loyal courtiers, and the ever-present priests. The sound of their prayers, the rustle of their robes, and the hushed tones of their conversations are all you hear. The king himself is a twisted, pained silhouette against the white linen of his bedsheets. His body, as you know, is in a state of advanced decay, and the smell, that persistent, cloying scent, is now a permanent fixture in the air. The vast vaulted ceilings and wide corridors of the Escorial, which once spoke of grandeur and authority, now serve to amplify the silence and the horror of the situation. It's a physical manifestation of his final, profound loneliness. A quirky and somewhat macabre tidbit about the Escorial is that Philip was not just building a palace and a monastery, but a pantheon for the Spanish royal family. He had a great mausoleum constructed beneath the basilica, a place where he and his ancestors would be interred. He spent a great deal of time and effort on its design, believing it to be a crucial part of his legacy. It's a detail that adds a strange and unsettling layer to his final days. He is dying in the very place he built for his own tomb. The walls that surround him are not just the walls of his home, but the walls of his final resting place. He is, quite literally, living in his own grave, a coffin made of granite and marble. It's a powerful and deeply unsettling symbol of his final, morbid obsession. Historians still argue whether Philip's immense investment of time and money in the Escorial was a reflection of his piety or a final self-aggrandizing act of an absolute monarch. Some believe it was a genuine expression of his faith, a desire to create a lasting monument to God. Others suggest that it was an act of political theatre, a way of cementing his dynasty's place in history and creating a new symbol of Spanish power. The truth, again, is likely a blend of both. Philip was a man who saw no separation between his duties to God and his duties to his kingdom. The Escorial, with its blend of monastery and palace, is a physical embodiment of this worldview, and now, in his final days, the very place he built to project his power has become a prison, a physical and spiritual cage that holds him fast as he rots away. You watch as his daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, a figure of grace and immense devotion, tends to him. She's one of the few people who can stand to be in his presence for long periods, her love for her father seemingly transcending the physical horror of his condition. She reads to him from the Bible. She holds his hand, and she whispers words of comfort in his ear. She is a bright spot of humanity in an otherwise grim and desolate scene. He in turn seems to find a moment of peace in her presence, a brief respite from the constant pain. But even her love cannot stop the inexorable march of the disease. The contrast between the outward grandeur of the Escorial and the inner, personal horror of the king's death is a profound and lasting image. The great halls, filled with priceless art and the echoes of a powerful reign, are now just a backdrop for a single, terrible drama. Philip is a man alone, surrounded by the physical evidence of his power, but utterly powerless. He's a king who built a palace to house his earthly body and his eternal soul, and now, in a final act of cosmic irony, he is a man whose body is turning on him in that very palace, a living, breathing testament to the fact that all the power in the world is no defence against the final and most gruesome betrayal of all. He is in his tomb already, and the end is drawing ever closer. The gilded cage of El Escorial, which you have been watching shrink around the dying king, has now been utterly consumed by the terrible reality within. The faint scent of decay you first noticed is now a powerful, unassailable presence, a tangible force that permeates every corner of the monastery palace. It is no longer just a smell, it is a character in this grim drama, a constant sickening reminder of the king's slow, horrifying demise. The air is so thick with it that it clings to everything, to the velvet of the curtains, to the polished granite of the walls, and to the very clothes of the courtiers who now approach his chambers with a handkerchief pressed to their noses. Philip II, the man who once commanded an empire, is now a source of profound physical and metaphorical rot. The source of the stench is, as you know, the horrific state of his body. The ulcers, which first appeared on his leg, have now merged into a vast festering wound that covers much of his lower body. A mainstream historical fact, though one often left out of the more dignified accounts of his reign, is that the doctors believed the only way to treat these wounds was to apply strong caustic salves, a treatment that only served to increase his suffering and, in a tragic irony, to deepen the putrefaction. The smell, a combination of old blood, decaying flesh, and these harsh chemical treatments, is a physical barrier that separates the king from his court. It is a symbol of his isolation, a kind of invisible quarantine that he has been placed in by his own failing body. You watch as his attendants, a small and devoted group of men, perform their grim duties. They are no longer tending to a monarch but to a piece of living, rotting flesh. They try to keep the sheets clean, but it's a losing battle. The bandages have to be changed multiple times a day, a process that causes the king to cry out in a low, pained voice that seems to come from a place of profound, inhuman suffering. The vermin, which you first learned about in whispers, are now an undeniable reality. They infest his bedding, and the attendants are tasked with the horrifying job of trying to keep them at bay, a task as futile as the doctor's attempts to heal him. He is a man being consumed by his own body, and the very life he is losing is attracting other, lesser forms of life to feast upon him. This physical stench has a profound effect on the political atmosphere of the court. A quirky and telling tidbit is that the powerful courtiers who once vied for an audience with the king now send their messengers instead. The grandees of Spain, the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, now stand in the antechamber, their faces pale and their conversations hushed, waiting for news. They no longer seek to be in the king's presence. They are repulsed by it. The smell is a physical manifestation of a moral and political decay that many in the court believe is spreading throughout the empire. The king's illness is not just a personal tragedy. It is a sign of a larger cosmic failing. They see his physical decay as a reflection of the spiritual decay of the kingdom, a sign that God is no longer smiling upon them. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Spanish Empire in the years following Philip's death was a direct consequence of his long illness. Some believe that the king's inability to govern effectively in his final months created a power vacuum and a climate of uncertainty that led to political instability. Others suggest that the decline was an inevitable result of Spain's overstretched empire, and that Philip's long illness was a symptom, not a cause, of a deeper malaise. The king, in his final days, was a metaphor for the state of his empire, a vast, powerful, and outwardly magnificent entity that was, in reality, rotting from the inside out. His suffering was a public performance of a private tragedy, and the court watched, horrified as the man who was Spain itself began to fall apart. The king, in the midst of this physical horror, is also wrestling with the symbolic weight of his own decay. He, a man who believed in order, in cleanliness, in the divine right of kings, is now a source of profound chaos and filth. He is no longer an image of God on earth. He is a testament to the frailty of the human body and the inevitability of decay. His religious devotion, which was once a source of strength, is now his only defence against the complete and utter humiliation of his condition. He spends his days in constant prayer, his hands clutching a crucifix, his lips moving silently. He's trying to find meaning in his suffering, to convince himself that this is all part of a larger divine plan. But you, a silent observer, can only see the immense tragedy of a man who built an empire, only to be utterly destroyed by his own flesh. The contrast between the outward splendour of the Escorial and the inner rot of its master is a theme that haunts this entire period. You walk through the grand halls, with their magnificent paintings and tapestries, and you are reminded of the sheer power and wealth that Philip commanded. But then, a faint, sickening odour reaches you from the direction of his chamber, and all of that grandeur becomes meaningless. The palace, which was supposed to be a testament to his eternal glory, is now a witness to his slow, agonizing end. The smell is a constant reminder of the fragility of power, the inevitability of death, and the complete and utter futility of all human endeavours in the face of our own mortality. The rot is not just in his body, it is in the very soul of the court, a silent, sickening presence that reminds everyone of the price of power and the final gruesome betrayal of all. The physical rot and its accompanying stench have, as you know, created a terrible atmosphere in the Escorial. But while the king's body is failing him, the political animal within the court is, for all intents and purposes, thriving. The solemnity of the last rites and the public piety of the courtiers were, in a way, just a momentary pause. The illness of the king, which has been so public and so prolonged, has created a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum various factions are now scrambling to make their moves. You're a silent witness to a new, more subtle kind of decay, the decay of loyalty and the rise of raw, naked ambition. The main concern, a mainstream historical fact, is the succession. Philip's heir is his young son, Philip III, a man who by most accounts lacks the iron will and tireless work ethic of his father. He is a young man, largely untested in the brutal world of international politics and court intrigue. The future of the Spanish Empire, a vast and unwieldy entity, is now in the hands of a boy. This simple fact has set off a frantic series of manoeuvres. You see them, the grandees of Spain, the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, gathering in hushed corners of the Escorial. They talk in low, conspiratorial tones, their eyes darting towards the king's chamber. They are no longer just mourning their sovereign, they are negotiating their own futures. The court is a microcosm of the entire empire, and it is now divided into two main factions. On one side, you have the faction loyal to the old guard, the men who served Philip II faithfully and believe in the continuation of his policies. They are led by figures like Cristobal de Mora, a man who was deeply trusted by the king. On the other side, you have the faction that sees the king's death as an opportunity to change the direction of the empire. They are led by Francisco Gómez de Sandoval, the Marquis of Denia, a man of immense ambition and a future favourite of the young Philip III. You can feel the tension between these two groups, a palpable sense of political rivalry that is completely at odds with the solemn atmosphere of the monastery. A quirky detail that reveals the true nature of this political manoeuvring is the use of letters and encrypted messages. Since the king is no longer able to give audiences or read long reports, the courtiers are communicating through coded notes, passed from hand to hand in the vast corridors of the Escorial. They are a kind of secret society, a group of powerful men and women who are making decisions about the future of an empire, while its ruler is slowly, horribly dying just a few feet away. This is not a time of grand pronouncements and open debate. It's a time of whispers, of hidden meanings, and of subtle gestures that can mean the difference between immense power and utter ruin. The dying king, in his bed, is completely unaware of the machinations that are taking place around him. Historians still argue whether the political instability that followed Philip II's death was an inevitable result of his long reign, or a direct consequence of the manoeuvring you are witnessing now. Some believe that Philip II's absolute and centralised style of government was simply unsustainable, and that the chaos that followed was a natural byproduct of such a system. Others suggest that the rise of figures like the Marquis of Denier and the subsequent decline of Spain's power were a direct result of these power struggles, that the old guard was pushed aside, and that the new regime was simply not up to the task of governing the vast empire. The king's bedchamber is not just a place of suffering, it is the eye of a political storm, and you are watching it all unfold. The king, in his suffering, is a kind of public monument to the fragility of power. His pain, which is so physical and so visceral, is a constant reminder to the courtiers that their own power is fleeting, that their own lives are finite. But instead of inspiring a kind of collective humility, it seems to have had the opposite effect. The courtiers, terrified by the spectacle of death, are clinging to power and ambition with an even fiercer grip. The fear of death, which should unite them, is instead dividing them. The rot that is consuming the king's body is also consuming the moral fabric of the court. The loyalty, the solemnity, the sense of a shared purpose that once defined Philip's court has been replaced by a quiet, gnawing sense of self-interest. You watch as the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, a figure of profound devotion and genuine grief, tries to maintain a sense of order. She is, in a way, the last bastion of the old guard, a symbol of the love and loyalty that is now fading. She tends to her father, she prays with him, and she tries to keep the court focused on the man, not the politics. But you can see the weariness in her eyes. She is fighting a losing battle against a force that is far greater than her own personal devotion. The old world is dying with her father, and a new one, a more brutal and less predictable one, is being born. The king is not just being devoured alive, he is being devoured by his own court, by the political animals he once commanded, and you, a silent observer, are watching the entire grim process unfold. The end is drawing near, and the vultures are already circling. The political manoeuvring and the stench of decay you've been witnessing are now overshadowed by a different, and in many ways more chilling kind of intrigue. For a court that has been wrestling with the gruesome physical reality of the king's illness, the question of what, exactly, is killing him has become an obsession. The official diagnoses of gout and dropsy, as you know, have long since been dismissed as insufficient, and the grotesque reality of his condition has led to a great deal of speculation. You're now a silent witness to the strange and whispered debate that is happening in the corridors of El Escorial. What if the king is suffering from leprosy? This is not a fringe theory. It is a serious question that has been raised by both contemporaries and modern historians. The symptoms, a mainstream historical fact, align in a terrifyingly accurate way with the known characteristics of the disease. The ulcers which have now spread and deepened, the sloughing of skin, the slow, methodical putrefaction of the flesh, all of it could be attributed to leprosy. The disease known as leprosy, or leprosy of the king, was a terrifying and highly stigmatized illness in the 16th century. It was believed to be a punishment from God, a physical manifestation of a profound spiritual failing. And for a man like Philip II, a man who saw himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, such a diagnosis would be a political and spiritual catastrophe. A quirky detail that adds fuel to this theory is the account of one of his physicians, a man who wrote in a private letter about the king's unnatural coldness and the peculiar discoloration of his skin, symptoms that can be associated with certain forms of leprosy. The physician was, of course, careful not to use the word itself. To even suggest that the king had such a loathsome disease would have been tantamount to treason. But the fear was there, a quiet, gnawing dread that clung to the court as surely as the stench of decay. The possibility that the king was not just dying, but was dying of such a humiliating and spiritually damning disease, was a source of profound unease. It would not just be the end of a king, but the end of a divine mandate. Historians still argue whether Philip II's illness was in fact leprosy. The symptoms, while aligned, are not a perfect match. Some scholars suggest that the ulcers were caused by a combination of a sedentary lifestyle, poor circulation, and a particularly nasty infection. Others believe it was a form of severe arthritis or a kidney disease that led to a secondary and truly horrific infection. The lack of a definitive diagnosis in the 16th century and the lack of a modern autopsy means that the true nature of his illness will likely remain a mystery. But the fact that the possibility of leprosy was whispered about in the corridors of power is a fascinating and telling detail. It reveals a great deal about the way the court, and the king himself, viewed illness and suffering. It was not just a biological event, it was a moral one, a kind of cosmic referendum on his life and reign. The king, in the midst of all this, is also wrestling with a profound psychological torment. You watch him as he lies in his bed, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion, and you can see the conflict in his eyes. He is a man who built his life on order, on control, and on the absolute certainty of his own divine mission. But now, he is a man in a state of complete physical and moral chaos. The disease, whatever its true nature, has stripped him of his dignity and his control. He is no longer a powerful monarch, he is a pathetic figure, rotting in his bed, surrounded by the physical evidence of his own powerlessness. This is a kind of torture that is far more profound than the physical pain. It is the torture of a man who is being forced to confront the limits of his own power, the fragility of his own body, and the terrible possibility that his life's work may have been built on a foundation of sand. The irony of the situation is almost unbearable. Philip II, a man who believed in the absolute purity of the Catholic faith, and who ordered the burning of thousands of heretics, is now a man whose body is in a state of utter impurity. He, a man who saw himself as a crusader for God, is now a man whose body is a testament to the frailty and corruption of all things earthly. He is a living paradox, a man who is both a saint and a sinner, a king and a beggar, a man of immense power who is utterly powerless. And the court, with its whispered rumours of leprosy, is wrestling with this very paradox. They are trying to find a theological explanation for a biological problem, and in doing so, they are only adding to the king's profound suffering. You watch as he clutches his crucifix, his lips moving silently in prayer. He is seeking a kind of spiritual absolution that his physical body is denying him. He is a man who is being devoured alive, not just by his illness, but by the relentless weight of his own legacy, and the terrible possibility that it was all for naught. The fear of leprosy, whether it was real or imagined, adds a new and more terrible layer to this final agonizing descent. It is a final humiliation, a final betrayal. And you, a silent observer, are watching it all unfold with a profound sense of horror and pity. The end is drawing ever closer, and the question of what, exactly, is killing him is becoming a more terrible and more important question than who he was in life. The debate about leprosy and the physical rot you've been a witness to are now a backdrop for an even deeper, more profound kind of agony. For Philip II, the physical torment of his dying body is now being mirrored by a mental and spiritual anguish that is almost unbearable to watch. He is a man caught between two worlds, the earthly world of his crumbling empire and his putrefying flesh, and the spiritual world of his fervent faith and his profound fear of damnation. You're a silent observer to a king's final battle, a battle for his own soul. As you look upon him, propped up on his pillows, his face a mask of gaunt suffering, you can see the ghosts of his past etched in the lines around his eyes. This is a man who was burdened with an almost impossible sense of duty from the moment he was born. He inherited an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it, and he believed, with every fibre of his being, that he was personally responsible for every detail of it. He was a micromanager of epic proportions, a man who would pore over every document, every letter, every decree, his famously tiny handwriting a testament to his relentless work ethic. But now, all of that power, all of that control has been stripped away. He is forced to confront the fact that his immense will, which once shaped the destiny of nations, is now utterly meaningless against the slow, methodical betrayal of his own body. The mental anguish is a two-pronged assault. On one hand, he is wrestling with the shame and humiliation of his physical condition. A king, a divine representative on earth, is supposed to be a figure of power and dignity, but Philip is anything but. He is a pathetic figure, a source of revulsion and pity. The very sight of him is a testament to the frailty of the human body and the futility of all earthly power. This is a profound and lasting blow to his ego, a man who built his entire life on the foundation of his own unassailable authority. It's a mainstream historical fact that he insisted on continuing to work from his deathbed, dictating letters and receiving reports, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of control in a situation that had spiralled completely out of it. It's a tragic and heartbreaking scene to watch. He is a king whose body has become his prison, and his immense will is the only thing that is keeping him going. On the other hand, there is the deep and abiding spiritual anguish. Philip was a man of profound and unshakable faith. He believed with every fibre of his being in the absolute truth of the Catholic Church. He saw himself as its protector, its champion, its righteous arm on earth. But in his final days, he's wrestling with the possibility that all of his piety, all of his crusades, all of his life's work may not be enough to secure his place in heaven. Remember his role in the Inquisition and the countless lives that were lost in the name of his faith? He believed it was a necessary and righteous act. But now, in the face of his own mortality, you can see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Is his suffering a divine test, or is it a punishment? Is he a martyr or a sinner? The questions must be a constant, tormenting presence in his mind. A quirky, almost touching tidbit is that he requested a book to be placed next to his bed. A copy of St. Augustine's Confessions. It is a book about a man's journey from sin to salvation, a testament to the power of God's grace. Philip, in his final days, was reading about a man who was forced to confront his own moral failings, his own imperfections. It's a poignant and powerful detail, a king who is trying to find solace in the words of a saint, a man who is trying to find a path to salvation in the face of his own profound suffering. It's a moment of immense vulnerability, a king who is admitting, in his own quiet way, that he is not a god, but a man flawed and imperfect. Historians still argue whether Philip II was truly a religious fanatic or a masterful politician who used religion as a tool to consolidate his power. Some scholars believe that his piety was genuine and that his final anguish was the result of a man who was truly terrified of God's judgment. Others suggest that his public displays of faith were a final act of political theatre, a way of shaping his legacy and ensuring that he would be remembered not as a tyrant but as a saint. The truth, as always, is probably a blend of both. He was a man for whom religion and politics were inextricably linked, and his final days are a testament to that complex and contradictory legacy. He's a man who is being devoured alive, not just by his illness, but by the weight of his own life, by the choices he made, and by the profound, terrifying uncertainty of what comes next. His body may be rotting, but his mind and his soul are in a state of far more profound and lasting torment. The physical pain is temporary, but the spiritual anguish will, for all you know, last for all of eternity. And you, a silent observer, can only watch the entire grim process unfold. The mental and physical torment of the dying king has now reached its grim crescendo. The debate about leprosy, the political manoeuvring, and the constant nagging stench of decay have all faded into the background. The focus for Philip II and for his small devoted retinue is now on a singular event, his final confession and absolution. You're a silent witness to a scene of profound piety, a moment where a king, in the full horrific throes of his slow, agonizing death, is trying to make peace with his God and with his legacy. The king, a man who once ruled an empire, is now a man of profound humility. He has requested that a priest be brought to his bedchamber, not just for a simple confession, but for a full and complete absolution of all his sins. The man who enters is a figure of quiet authority, the king's confessor, a man who has heard the deepest and darkest secrets of the most powerful man in the world. The room is hushed, the attendants are all sent out, and you are left alone to watch the scene unfold. Philip, propped up on his pillows, his body a twisted mess of agony, begins to speak in a low, pained voice. He is not just confessing his personal sins, he is confessing the sins of his reign. He's a man who is reckoning with a lifetime of choices, a man who is trying to find a spiritual justification for the countless lives that were lost in the name of his faith and his empire. This is a mainstream historical fact, though one often romanticized, that a king's final confession was a matter of immense political and spiritual importance. It was not just a private act of piety, it was a public declaration of his faith and a final statement of his beliefs. Philip II, a man who was deeply aware of his place in history, knew that his final moments would be scrutinized. He wanted to be remembered not as a tyrant or a failed monarch, but as a devoted son of the Church, a man who, despite his failings, had sought and received God's grace. His confession was a final, desperate act of control, a way of shaping his legacy even in the face of his own complete physical collapse. A quirky and deeply poignant tidbit about this time is that he requested a specific item to be brought to his bedside, a small, hand-painted crucifix that his father, the great Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had held on his own deathbed. It is a powerful symbol, a physical connection between two of history's most powerful rulers, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. The crucifix, now in Philip's hands, is a testament to the weight of his legacy and the profound burden of his position. He is not just a man who is dying. He is a link in a chain of power, and he is trying to ensure that the link does not break. He is trying to find solace in the shared experience of his father's final moments, a kind of unspoken conversation between a son and a man who understood the profound loneliness of being a king. Historians still argue whether Philip's final confession and absolution were a genuine spiritual experience or a final masterful act of political theatre. Some scholars believe that he was a true penitent, a man who was genuinely terrified of God's judgment and who was seeking true absolution. Others suggest that his confession was a calculated move, a way of ensuring that his legacy would be seen through the lens of a pious, faithful king. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. He was a man for whom religion and politics were inextricably linked, and his final days are a testament to that complex and contradictory legacy. He was a man who, even as his body was failing him, was still trying to be a king. The priest, having heard his confession, then performs the sacrament of anointing of the sick. The holy oil is applied to his forehead, his hands, and his feet. It is a solemn and profound moment, a physical act of spiritual cleansing in the midst of physical decay. You watch as the king, his eyes closed, seems to find a moment of peace, a brief respite from the constant pain. The sound of the Latin prayers, the chinking of the thurible, and the low, solemn voice of the priest all create a sense of profound, solemn finality. This is not a time for miracles or for a last-minute cure. This is a time for acceptance, for a final, graceful surrender. The political factions you've been a witness to are now forced to be quiet. The solemnity of the occasion is a powerful deterrent to any further manoeuvring. They are all forced to stand and watch as their king, their sovereign, prepares to meet his maker. It is a moment of profound humility for them all, a reminder that for all their power and ambition, they too will one day have to face their own final reckoning. The rot that is consuming the king's body is a powerful metaphor for the rot that is in the heart of all men, and they are all forced to confront it. The king's final confession and absolution is a moment of profound transformation. He is no longer just a king. He is a man who is preparing to die. He is a man who is trying to find a kind of spiritual dignity in the face of his own complete physical humiliation. He is a man who is being devoured alive, and in this final, desperate act of faith he is trying to ensure that his soul is not devoured with him. The end is drawing near, and you, a silent observer, are watching a king's final and most profound act of faith. He is trying to find a way to make his peace with the world and with himself before he is finally consumed. The solemnity of the king's final confession has created a brief, profound moment of peace, a kind of spiritual eye in the hurricane of his suffering. But as you know, this quietude cannot last. The disease which has been devouring him for months is not finished. You are about to witness a cruel and heartbreaking twist in this grim drama, a false glimmer of hope, a moment of respite that will be followed by a relapse so swift and so terrible that it will make all the previous suffering seem like a mere prelude. For a few days, a quiet miracle seems to be taking place. The king's fever, which has been a constant tormenting presence, begins to subside. The ulcers on his body, while still horrific, seem to stop spreading. He even manages to eat a little solid food and to speak in a voice that is stronger and less pained than it has been in weeks. The court, which has been in a state of profound collective dread, is suddenly filled with a cautious, almost terrifying hope. The courtiers, the doctors, even the priests, they all begin to whisper about a divine intervention, a last-minute miracle granted by God to his most faithful servant. They believe that his suffering has been a test and that he has passed it. They are celebrating too soon, a mainstream historical fact of this time, a moment of profound miscalculation. You can almost feel the collective breath of the court being held. The atmosphere in the Escorial, once so heavy with decay and dread, is now filled with a fragile, almost unbearable lightness. The king's daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, a figure of such profound love and devotion, allows a flicker of joy to cross her face. She's been tending to her father with an iron will and a love that seemed to transcend the physical horror of his condition. She truly believes that her prayers have been answered, that her father will be spared. She's a powerful and poignant reminder of the profound human need to believe in a happy ending, even when all the evidence points to a tragic one. A quirky detail from this period is the sheer number of prayers and masses that were offered for the king's recovery. Churches across the Spanish Empire, from the grand cathedrals of Madrid and Seville to the small mission churches in the New World, were filled with people praying for their king. The clergy, in their sermons, spoke of Philip's suffering as a kind of holy penance, a trial sent by God to purify the king, and by extension, the entire empire. The king's apparent improvement was, for them, a confirmation of this belief, a sign that God was indeed listening. This collective and ultimately false hope reveals a great deal about the spiritual and political power of the king. He was not just a man, he was a symbol, and his suffering was a public drama of immense importance. Historians still argue whether this brief period of remission was a natural part of the illness's progression or a genuine medical phenomenon. Some scholars suggest that the body, in its final throes, can sometimes muster a final burst of strength, a kind of last gasp of vitality before the final collapse. Others believe that the king's mental state, which was undoubtedly buoyed by the belief that he was recovering, had a temporary and psychosomatic effect on his physical condition. The truth is unknowable, but the effect was the same. The court and the king himself were granted a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a future that would never be. The crash when it comes is swift and brutal. You are in the king's chamber when it happens. The low fever, which had been gone for days, returns with a vengeance. The ulcers on his body, which had seemed to be holding steady, begin to spread again, weeping and festering with a renewed ferocity. The king, who had been speaking in a stronger voice, now falls back into a state of semi-consciousness, his body racked with pain and fever. The hope, which had been so strong, is now replaced by profound and lasting despair. The attendants, who had been so optimistic, now go about their grim duties with a new and terrible finality. They know, that this is the end. There will be no more miracles. The psychological impact of this relapse is immense. For the king, it is a final crushing blow. The hope he had briefly entertained, the belief that his suffering was a test that he had passed, is now gone. He is forced to confront the terrible reality that his agony is not a test, but a sentence. For the court, the relapse is a powerful and sobering reminder of their own mortality and the futility of their hopes. The political factions, which had briefly paused their manoeuvring, now return to their work with a renewed sense of urgency. The time for waiting is over. The king is dying, and his death is no longer a matter of if, but when. The brief glimmer of hope, followed by the terrible relapse, is a final cruel act in this grim drama. It is a moment that shatters the last illusions of the king and his court, a moment that leaves them all with a profound and lasting sense of despair. The king, who was once a symbol of divine authority, is now a symbol of the futility of all human endeavours in the face of our own mortality. He's a man who is being devoured alive, and in this final, cruel twist, he's being forced to confront the terrible truth that his suffering has no meaning, no purpose, and no end. The end is drawing ever closer, and you, a silent observer, can only watch as the final agonizing chapter of his life begins. The cruel, false hope has now been replaced by a quiet, terrible finality. The court, which once buzzed with whispered optimism, has now fallen into a state of profound collective grief. You are about to witness a series of heart-wrenching scenes, the final farewells of a family to their dying patriarch, a man who, for all his power and his piety, is now simply a father and a husband who is about to be taken away. The grand stage of El Escorial, which once saw the coronation of kings and the signing of treaties, is now the backdrop for a series of intimate private tragedies. The king's daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, a woman of such immense devotion and love, is now his primary caregiver. She's a mainstream historical fact, though her role is often minimised, that she spent his final months tending to him with an almost saintly patience. You watch as she sits by his bedside, her hand holding his, her face a mask of profound sorrow. She's not just mourning her father, she's mourning the loss of a man who was her entire world. She reads to him from the Bible, she sings him songs from his youth, and she tries to comfort him in the only way she can. The physical horror of his condition, the smell, the vermin, the ulcers. None of it matters to her. She sees not a king, but a father, and her love is a beautiful, fragile thing in this sea of decay. One of the most poignant and frankly quirky details from this period is a letter she wrote to her brother, the future King Philip III. In it, she describes her father's condition in a way that is both heartbreaking and deeply human. She wrote of how he would ask her to place the crucifix in his hands, and how he would beg for God's forgiveness in a voice that was barely a whisper. She spoke of her own immense pain, not just for her father, but for the future of the kingdom. She was a woman who was caught between her love for her father and her duty to her country, and her final farewells were a blend of both. Her letters are a rare glimpse into the private life of a monarch, a testament to the fact that for all their power, they too are just people, with families and feelings and fears. The king's son, the future Philip III, also comes to say his goodbyes. He is a young man, largely untested, and you can see the profound fear and apprehension in his eyes. He is not just losing his father, he is about to inherit the most powerful, and in many ways, most troubled, empire in the world. He approaches his father's bed with a mixture of reverence and terror, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Philip II, in a final act of a father's love, gives him his last instructions. He tells him to be a good Catholic, to love his people, and to be a just ruler. He reminds him of the profound burden of his position and the need for a strong and unyielding faith. It is a moment of profound significance, a final passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Historians still argue whether Philip II's last words to his son were a genuine expression of his love and faith, or a final, masterful act of political instruction. Some scholars believe that he was a man who, to the very end, was thinking of his legacy and the future of his empire. Others suggest that his words were a genuine fatherly expression of his love and his profound fear for his son's future. The truth, as always, is probably a blend of both. He was a man for whom his family, his faith and his empire were inextricably linked, and his final goodbyes are a testament to that complex and contradictory legacy. He was a father and a king, and he was trying to fulfill both roles to the very end. The final farewells are not just a family affair. The grandees of Spain, the powerful nobles who were once circling like vultures, are now forced to pay their respects. They approach the king's bed, their heads bowed, their faces a mixture of genuine sorrow and a barely concealed sense of relief. They are not just saying goodbye to a man, they are saying goodbye to an era. The old world, the world of Philip II, is dying, and they know it. They are preparing for the new world, the world of Philip III, and they know that their own futures are in the balance. The final goodbyes are a powerful and sobering reminder that for all their power and ambition, they too will one day have to face their own final reckoning. The king, in the midst of all this, seems to be receding from the world. His eyes are often closed, his breathing is shallow, and his body is a twisted mess of pain and exhaustion. He seems to be in a state of profound, peaceful resignation. The final farewells are not a source of sadness for him, they are a source of comfort. He is surrounded by the people he loves, and he knows that he is not alone. He is a man who is being devoured alive, but in this final private moment, he is finding a kind of solace in the love of his family. He is a king who is preparing to die, but he is a father who is preparing to leave his family, and you, a silent observer, are watching a man say goodbye to his family, his kingdom and his life. The end is drawing ever closer, and you are watching a man find a kind of peace in the final, terrible hours of his life. The intimate farewells and profound sadness of the previous section have given way to a new kind of public drama. The king's suffering is no longer just a personal tragedy. It is now a matter of immense public interest, a subject of fervent debate and speculation in the streets of Madrid and across the Spanish Empire. You are a silent witness to a kingdom wrestling with the image of its dying king, torn between reverence for a holy martyr and a quiet, gnawing sense of resentment for a tyrant. The narrative of his death is no longer his own. It is being shaped and reshaped by a populace trying to make sense of a long, and in many ways, contradictory reign. In the public eye, there are two distinct narratives of Philip's final days. The first, and most prevalent, is that of the holy martyr. This is the official story, the one being carefully cultivated by the clergy and the loyalists at court. They preach that the king's suffering is a testament to his profound piety, a final, painful tests sent by God to purify his soul and ensure his place in heaven. They point to his unwavering faith, his constant prayers, and his stoic endurance of the most unimaginable agony as proof of his sanctity. They are crafting a narrative of a man who in his final moments is a physical embodiment of the suffering of Christ, a king who is being sacrificed for the good of his people. This is a mainstream historical fact, the use of a king's death to legitimize a dynasty and to reinforce the power of the church. The king's body, in its slow, agonizing decay, is being transformed into a holy relic, a symbol of divine grace and unshakable faith. The other narrative, whispered in taverns and in the back alleys of the cities, is far less charitable. This narrative paints the king's suffering not as a divine test, but as a just and terrible punishment. For a large portion of the population, Philip's reign was a time of immense hardship. He was a man who, in his pursuit of religious orthodoxy and his endless wars, had driven the country to the brink of bankruptcy. His obsession with the Inquisition, his relentless persecution of heretics, and his tyrannical style of rule had made him many enemies, both at home and abroad. For these people, the king's agonizing death is not a sign of his holiness, it is a sign of God's justice. They see his rotting body not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as a symbol of the rot that had taken hold of the kingdom under his rule. This is a darker, more cynical view, but a no less powerful one. It is a quiet, gnawing resentment that is only just beginning to surface. A quirky, almost touching tidbit is the account of a young friar who was tending to the king in his final days. The friar, in a letter to his superior, wrote of how the king would often ask to be read to from the Gospels, and how he would often pause to ask questions about the nature of sin and forgiveness. The friar noted that the king seemed to be genuinely terrified of damnation, and that his piety was not just a public performance, but a deeply personal and profound fear. This account, a rare glimpse into the king's private moments, complicates both narratives. It suggests that he was neither a flawless martyr nor an unrepentant tyrant, but a man caught in the middle, a man wrestling with his own legacy and his profound fear of what comes after death. He was a man who, in his final moments, was just a man, with all the fears and doubts that entails. Historians still argue whether Philip II's public image was genuinely divided, or if the resentment was a much smaller phenomenon, confined to a few disgruntled elements. Some scholars believe that the king's death was a powerful catalyst for a growing public discontent, and that the decline of the Spanish Empire in the years that followed was not just a political event but a profound spiritual and moral one. Others suggest that the narrative of the holy martyr was the dominant one, and that any resentment was quickly quashed by the immense power of the church and the state. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably a blend of both. The king's death was a profound and lasting event, and it gave people a chance to reflect on his legacy, both good and bad. The king, in his final days, is utterly unaware of this public debate. He is lost in a world of his own, a world of pain and prayer, a world of profound loneliness. He's a man who's being devoured alive, and the only thing that matters to him now is his own soul. The world which he once commanded with such absolute authority is now a distant, blurry thing. His final moments are not for the public, they are for him and for God. He is a king who is preparing to die, but he is a man who is preparing to meet his Maker. You watch as the news of his worsening condition spreads through the Escorial and beyond. The solemnity that once filled the monastery is now replaced by a quiet, gnawing sense of anticipation. The courtiers, the clergy, the nobles, they are all waiting. They are waiting for the final word, the final breath. They are waiting for the end of an era, and for the beginning of a new one. The king's suffering, which was once a source of personal pain, is now a source of public drama, a political and spiritual battle being fought over his dying body. And you, a silent observer, are watching it all unfold with a profound sense of awe and pity. The end is drawing ever closer, and the image of the dying king is being shaped and reshaped in the crucible of public opinion. The public debate and the family's goodbyes have now faded into the background, replaced by a single, unwavering focus: the excruciating final weeks of the king's life. You're a silent witness to a drama of profound and lasting horror, a period where the king's body, which has been in a state of slow decay, now gives way completely. The air in the Escorial, once heavy with the smell of decay, is now a suffocating miasma of death, and the king's chamber has become a kind of biological hell. He's no longer just bedridden. He's a permanent suffering fixture in his bed, a man whose body is now a twisted mess of agony and decay. The ulcers you have been a witness to have now merged into a vast open wound that covers his entire back and lower body. The doctors, in a final act of desperation, have stopped trying to heal him and are now simply trying to keep him from bleeding to death. They apply powerful astringents and salves, a treatment that causes him to cry out in a low, inhuman voice that seems to come from the very depths of his soul. The pain is no longer intermittent. It is a constant, screaming reality, a torment that is far more profound than anything you have witnessed before. A quirky and frankly horrifying detail from this time is that the king's body was now so badly afflicted that his attendants had to cut a hole in his mattress to accommodate the vast weeping wounds on his back. You can almost picture the scene. A man, once the most powerful in the world, lying in his bed, a hole cut into the very fabric of his resting place, a testament to the fact that his body was no longer a normal human form. This detail, a mainstream historical fact though one often left out of the more dignified accounts of his reign, is a powerful and brutal reminder of the sheer physical horror of his death. He is not just dying, he is disintegrating, his body falling apart in a slow, agonizing process. Historians still argue whether the final weeks of the king's life were a period of profound spiritual peace or a time of utter, unremitting agony. Some scholars suggest that the king, in his feverish state, had moments of lucidity where we would find a kind of solace in his faith, a belief that his suffering was a kind of holy penance. Others believe that the pain was so profound and so constant that it would have been impossible for him to find any kind of peace. The truth is unknowable, but the effect was the same. The king's final weeks were a period of unremitting torment, a time where his body and his mind were in a state of complete and utter collapse. The court, which has been in a state of profound collective dread, is now completely silent. The courtiers, the clergy, the nobles, they are all waiting. They are waiting for the final word, the final breath. They are waiting for the end of an era and for the beginning of a new one. The king, in his final moments, is a man who is utterly alone, surrounded by people who are waiting for him to die. The love and devotion of his daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, is the only thing that is keeping him going. She's a powerful and poignant reminder of the profound human need to believe in a happy ending, even when all the evidence points to a tragic one. She is his final connection to the world of the living, and you watch her as she sits by his bedside, her hand holding his, her face a mask of profound sorrow. The king's body, which has been in a state of slow decay, is now completely giving way. He can no longer speak. His breathing is shallow and ragged, and his eyes are often closed. He is lost in a world of his own, a world of pain and prayer, a world of profound loneliness. He is a man who is being devoured alive, and the only thing that matters to him now is his own soul. The world, which he once commanded with such absolute authority, is now a distant, blurry thing. His final moments are not for the public. They are for him and for God. He is a king who is preparing to die, but he is a man who is preparing to meet his Maker. The final weeks of the king's life are a period of profound and lasting horror. It is a time where a man who once commanded an empire is reduced to a pathetic figure, a source of revulsion and pity. It is a time where the grand stage of El Escorial, which once spoke of grandeur and authority, is now a witness to a final brutal drama. The king's body is a testament to the fragility of human life and the inevitability of decay. He is a man who is being devoured alive, and in this final cruel twist, he is being forced to confront the terrible truth that his suffering has no meaning, no purpose, and no end. The end is drawing ever closer, and you, a silent observer, can only watch as the final, agonizing chapter of his life begins. The king's body is giving way, and his soul is preparing to leave. The final weeks of the king's life have been a period of unremitting horror, a time where his body has been in a state of slow and agonizing decay. But as the physical torment reaches its crescendo, you're now a silent witness to a new, and in many ways more profound, kind of drama. The legacy of a dying king. The man in the bed, once a powerful and unyielding force, is no longer just a man. He is a symbol, a testament to a life of immense power and profound darkness. You're watching a life's work being weighed in the balance, a legacy being shaped in the crucible of his final, agonizing moments. The legacy of Philip II is a complex and contradictory one, a mainstream historical fact that is still debated by scholars today. He was, by any measure, a man of immense power and achievement. He inherited an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it, and he expanded it even further, annexing Portugal and its vast colonial holdings. He was a masterful bureaucrat, a man who, from his quiet study in the Escorial, controlled the destinies of millions. He was a champion of the Catholic faith, a man who believed with every fibre of his being that he was God's chosen instrument on earth. He built the Escorial, a monument to his piety and his power that still stands today. These are the achievements, the grand, sweeping gestures that define his reign. But they are not the whole story. There is a darker, more troubling side to his legacy. He was a man who, in his pursuit of religious orthodoxy, was also responsible for the deaths of thousands in the Inquisition. He was a man who in his endless wars drove his country to the brink of bankruptcy. He was a man who was by all accounts cold, distant and unyielding, a man who valued his duty to God and to his empire above all else, even his own family. His relationship with his son, Don Carlos, was a source of profound tragedy. A man who, in his paranoia and his fear, had his own son arrested and imprisoned. The legacy of Philip II is a story of immense power and immense cruelty, a story of a man who was both a saint and a sinner. A quirky detail that adds to this complexity is the fact that Philip II, in his final will, left a specific instruction that a painting by the artist Titian, a work called The Martyrdom of St. Lawrence, be placed in his final resting place. This is a profound and poignant detail. The painting, a work of immense power and graphic detail, depicts the saint being slowly roasted alive on a grill. Philip, in his final days, was a man who was being slowly devoured alive by his own disease. He was a man who was suffering in a way that was almost biblical in its scale. By choosing this specific painting, he was, in a way, identifying with the saint, a man who was suffering for his faith. It is a final, masterful act of self-mythologizing, a man who, even in death, was trying to shape his own narrative. Historians still argue whether Philip's legacy was one of success or failure. Some scholars believe that he was the last of the medieval monarchs, a man who was hopelessly out of step with the modern world. They point to the decline of the Spanish Empire in the years following his death as proof of his failure. Others suggest that he was a victim of his own success, a man who inherited an empire that was simply too vast and too complex to govern effectively. They argue that his legacy was one of immense achievement, and that the decline of Spain was an inevitable result of a changing world, not a personal failing. The truth, as always, is probably a blend of both. He was a man who was caught between two worlds, a man who was both a product of his time and a man who was trying to bend the future to his will. The king, in his final hours, is utterly unaware of this debate. He is lost in a world of his own, a world of pain and prayer, a world of profound loneliness. His body is giving way completely, and his breathing is shallow and ragged. He is a man who is being devoured alive, and the only thing that matters to him now is his own soul. The world, which he once commanded with such absolute authority, is now a distant, blurry thing. His final moments are not for the public, they are for him and for God. He is a king who is preparing to die, but he is a man who is preparing to meet his maker. The legacy of Philip II, a man who was both a saint and a sinner, a man of immense power and profound darkness, is a testament to the complexity and the contradictions of human life. He was a man who built an empire, only to see it begin to rot from the inside out. He was a man who was a champion of his faith, only to be consumed by his own physical decay. He was a man who, in his final agonizing moments, was trying to make sense of a life that was both a triumph and a tragedy. And you, a silent observer, are watching a man's final moments, a time where his legacy is being weighed and his soul is preparing to leave. The end is drawing ever closer, and the legacy of the dying king is being shaped in the crucible of his final agonizing moments. The legacy of a dying king and the public debate surrounding his suffering have now been overshadowed by a single, profound event: the final moments of his life. You're a silent witness to the end of an era, a time where a man who once commanded an empire is now a man who is preparing to take his final breath. The air in the Escorial, once thick with the stench of decay and the low hum of court intrigue, is now filled with a profound and lasting silence. All that can be heard is the faint, ragged sound of the king's breathing, a fragile, desperate testament to his last moments of life. The king is in a state of deep unconsciousness, his body a twisted mess of pain and exhaustion. The ulcers, which have been a source of such unremitting horror, are now a silent testament to his long, agonizing demise. The attendants, who have been tending to him for months, are now simply waiting. Their faces a mask of profound exhaustion and sorrow. The Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia, a figure of such immense devotion and love, is by his bedside, her hand holding his, her face a mask of profound sorrow. She's a powerful and poignant reminder of the profound human need to believe in a happy ending, even when all the evidence points to a tragic one. She is his final connection to the world of the living, and you watch her as she whispers words of comfort in his ear, a final, heartbreaking act of love. A quirky detail from this time is the king's request to have a specific crucifix placed in his hands, the same crucifix that his father, the great Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had held on his own deathbed. This is a profound and poignant detail, a physical connection between two of history's most powerful rulers, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. The crucifix now in Philip's hands is a testament to the weight of his legacy and the profound burden of his position. He is not just a man who is dying, he is a link in a chain of power, and he is trying to ensure that the link does not break. He is trying to find solace in the shared experience of his father's final moments, a kind of unspoken conversation between a son and a man who understood the profound loneliness of being a king. This is a mainstream historical fact, though its significance is often overlooked, that the king's death was a meticulously choreographed event, a final piece of political theatre. The priests, who have been a constant presence in his final months, are now gathered around his bed, their voices a low, sonorous hum as they read the final prayers. The court, which has been in a state of profound collective dread, is now completely silent. The courtiers, the clergy, the nobles, they are all waiting. They are waiting for the final word, the final breath. They are waiting for the end of an era, and for the beginning of a new one. The king's suffering, which was once a source of personal pain, is now a source of public drama, a political and spiritual battle being fought over his dying body. Historians still argue whether Philip's final moments were a period of profound spiritual peace or a time of utter, unremitting agony. Some scholars suggest that the king, in his feverish state, had moments of lucidity where he would find a kind of solace in his faith, a belief that his suffering was a kind of holy penance. Others believe that the pain was so profound and so constant that it would have been impossible for him to find any kind of peace. The truth is unknowable, but the effect was the same. The king's final moments were a period of unremitting torment, a time where his body and his mind were in a state of complete and utter collapse. The king's last breath is not a dramatic, sudden event. It is a slow, gradual fading away, a quiet release from a body that has been in a state of such profound agony for so long. The ragged sound of his breathing, which has been a constant presence, now becomes fainter and fainter until finally it stops. The silence that follows is profound and lasting, a silence that is broken only by the quiet sobs of his daughter and the low murmur of the priest's prayers. The king is dead. The most powerful man in Europe, the man who once commanded an empire, is now a man who is utterly and completely at peace. The end of the king's life is a moment of profound transformation. He is no longer just a king, he is a man who has passed from this life to the next. The political factions, which have been manoeuvring for months, are now forced to be quiet. The solemnity of the occasion is a powerful deterrent to any further manoeuvring. They are all forced to stand and watch as their king, their sovereign, is taken away. It is a moment of profound humility for them all, a reminder that for all their power and ambition, they too will one day have to face their own final reckoning. The rot that is consuming the king's body is a powerful metaphor for the rot that is in the heart of all men, and they are all forced to confront it. The king's last breath is the end of an era. The old world, the world of Philip II, is dead, and a new world, a more brutal and less predictable one, is being born. The king is a man who is preparing to die, but he is a man who is preparing to meet his maker. He is a king who is preparing to leave his family, his kingdom, and his life. And you, a silent observer, are watching a man say goodbye to his family, his kingdom, and his life. The end is here, and you are watching a man find a kind of peace in the final, terrible hours of his life. The final, ragged breath you witnessed has now been replaced by a profound and lasting silence. King Philip II is dead. The great drama of his long, agonizing demise has reached its conclusion, but the story, as you know, does not end there. A new, more public drama is about to begin, a final piece of political theatre, the king's grand state funeral and the lingering, unspoken horror of his final months. The contrast between the lavish ceremony and the grotesque reality of his death is the final, brutal irony of his life. The news of the king's death, a mainstream historical fact, was met with a carefully orchestrated display of public grief. In the days following his death on September 13th, 1598, the Spanish Empire plunged into a period of formal mourning. Bells tolled in every city, masses were held in every church, and the court, dressed in the sombre black that Philip himself favoured, went into seclusion. The narrative of the holy martyr, which had been carefully cultivated in his final months, was now being cemented into history. The king's suffering was presented not as a medical tragedy, but as a spiritual triumph, a final, painful journey that had led him to salvation. This was not a time for a sober reflection on his reign. It was a time for a grand, public display of reverence and piety. The funeral itself was an event of immense scale and pageantry. The king's body, which had been so ravaged by disease, was embalmed and prepared for burial. The process of embalming was a delicate and difficult one, a testament to the embalmer's skill and the king's long, agonizing demise. The body was then placed in a magnificent coffin and moved to the Basilica of El Escorial, the very place he had designed to be his final resting place. The journey was a slow, solemn procession, with priests, nobles, and his family all walking behind the coffin. The procession was a powerful and public statement of the continuity of the Spanish monarchy, a final, unyielding act of defiance against the rot and the decay that had consumed the king's body. A quirky detail that adds to the grim irony of the funeral is the fact that the funeral sermon was delivered by Fray Geronimo de Sotomayor, a priest who had been a constant presence in the king's final months. In his sermon, he spoke of the king's suffering in almost biblical terms, comparing his agony to the passion of Christ and his endurance to the stoicism of the great martyrs. He, of course, made no mention of the ulcers, the stench, or the vermin. He spoke of the king's death as a beautiful, holy event, a final act of devotion that had led him to a place of eternal rest. It was a narrative that was completely at odds with the reality you have been a witness to, a final, public lie that was designed to cement his legacy and to reassure a terrified public. Historians still argue whether the public's acceptance of this narrative was a genuine belief in the king's sanctity or a simple act of political acquiescence. Some scholars believe that the public was genuinely moved by the story of a king's suffering, and that the narrative of the holy martyr was a powerful and comforting one, in a time of immense change and uncertainty. Others suggest that the narrative was an act of a powerful state and a powerful church to control the public discourse, and that any dissent was quickly and brutally silenced. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably a blend of both. The king's death was a profound and lasting event, and it gave people a chance to reflect on his legacy, both good and bad. The king's body was finally laid to rest in the Pantheon de los Reyes, the royal mausoleum beneath the Basilica of El Escorial. The mausoleum, which Philip had spent so much time and effort designing, was a magnificent and powerful statement of the continuity of his dynasty. It was a place where he would be surrounded by his ancestors, and where he would be a silent, powerful presence for generations to come. The burial was a final, solemn act, a moment where a man who had been consumed by rot and decay was finally given a place of rest. The mausoleum, a place of immense grandeur and symbolism, was a powerful and lasting testament to the king's life and legacy. The final lingering horror of the king's death is the unspoken secret that everyone at court knows, but no one dares to mention. They all know of the ulcers, the stench, the vermin, and the agony that he endured. They all know that the public narrative of the holy martyr is a carefully constructed lie, and they all know that the rot that consumed the king's body is a powerful metaphor for the rot that has taken hold of the court and the empire. They are all complicit in the lie, and in their complicity they are all bound together by a single unspoken truth. The king may be dead, but his memory and the horror of his final months will linger for generations to come. The story, as you know, ends with the king's death, but the legacy and the horror of his final months will linger. The rot that consumed his body is a powerful metaphor for the rot that is in the heart of all men, and they are all forced to confront it. The king is dead, but his memory and the horror of his final months will linger for generations to come. He is a king who, in his final agonizing moments, was a man who was devoured alive. Slowly the final images of the funeral procession fade, and the grand, cold walls of the Escorial recede into the shadows. The sound of the tolling bells grows softer, a distant chime echoing in the vast, silent night. The story of King Philip II's final journey is a sombre one, a tale of immense power undone by the frailty of the flesh. All of the grandeur, all of the authority, all of the pious devotion, it all came down to a man, alone in a room, grappling with the profound and profoundly humbling reality of his own mortality. It's a quiet reminder that in the end, no matter who we are, no matter how powerful, we are all just flesh and bone, susceptible to the same frailties and subject to the same final reckoning. The human body is a beautiful, fragile, and sometimes terrible thing. Now, as the final echoes of our story fade, let's let the images of decay and the sounds of sorrow recede completely. Turn off the light. Settle deeper into your pillow. Let the slow, rhythmic breathing of sleep replace the ragged gasps of the dying king. Let the quiet of the night wash away the grim details, leaving only the soft hum of your fan and the gentle pulse of your own heart. All is well.